Welcome back to the third part of subconscious, and this is the final part. This isn't going to be very long. Ultimately, what I've got to tell you about is that we're in a battle for the mind. Technology has become such that there's an awful lot going on that is vying for our attention and is trying to reach into the reticular activation system by tapping our emotion, filling us full of dopamine, and is using those vehicles as a means to further advance ideas by some people who simply want to manipulate the way that you think, what you buy, and how you vote. Now, I know that this sounds political or somehow conspiracy theory, but the fact is, look at the bioethicist James DiGiordano. For the last 10 years, he's been talking about bone conduction as a means by which of implanting thoughts. You think they're your thoughts, they're not. So what is this of implanting thoughts? You think they're your thoughts, they're not. So what does this have to do with the subconscious? If we're hearing things, it's going to tap into our value system. But here's what you need to know from somebody who has delivered hypnosis and has studied hypnosis for probably the last 10 years. We'll act against our own best interest a lot. We do. Because there's a couple of factors that play into this. And from a psychological standpoint, one of those factors is groupthink. We don't like to be an outlier. Thank you, Malcolm Gladwell, for showing us that in both Outliers and in the book Tipping Point. The other thing that we know from human psychology as well as human motivation, motivation psychology, and a plethora of other fields of study around why we do what we do, not just to include motivation. We have a tendency to want to belong to something that is bigger than us and have an identity as a part of a group. So all of this is, basically Psych 101. If you recall from any of the psychology classes that you had, there is an underlying need to feel a part of a group. This is how communities form. The problem is that there are people at a distance who are creating nefarious platforms to be able to manipulate what you think and what you do. Now, ask yourself, what do I believe? Because everything is filtered through our belief system, and that lens is what shapes our values. It also shapes how we deal with issues that are stuck in the subconscious. Now, as a clinical therapist, when I talk to people about their interpretation of events and how they created meaning around those events, this is often the first step in understanding what happened to create, as I indicated in the last two videos, the difference between someone who runs to the sound of gunfire and someone who freezes, or someone who runs away, someone who fawns. Now, those are basic premises that most of us are aware of. But here's what you may not understand about that. We can overcome our own best interest and do things that go very much against what we believe in. Now, where it becomes tricky is that there's a wonderful story that was told by military personnel working for one of the three-letter agencies who commented, we did an action at a distance using satellite communication in order to be able to influence people to lay down their firearms and stop fighting. We just pretended to be the voice of God in their head. Stop and think about that for a minute. I mean, really stop and think about that for a minute. What are the implications there? And if you've been listening to Google at Davos, they're very much in favor of being able to manipulate what we think at a distance because it's a form of slavery. Now, I'm talking to you about this not as a means to scare you or to, in any way force you to, go running to Google and shake your fist at them. What I'm suggesting, though, is that you pay attention to what you think and how you think and what you believe. The other thing that I'm inviting you to consider is how much technology are you around and how much time do you spend in front of technology? Because a great through vehicle is technology. I'm going to try to sync up some of these pictures. My second part of subconscious I've had a terrible time both with software, but I've also had a terrible time with the internet this week. As you know, Ma Bell kept going down this week. And where I'm at in this part of the world, I'm lucky if I can hold a connection. In fact, I couldn't even do telehealth tonight with clients because it kept going in and out. And I ended up having to do a telephone call, which is weird. That all aside, you notice that I've got some graphics up there. One of these is about dissociation. Think about moments when we are lost in thought. We kind of become an empty vessel, but that's when we're also most approachable, when we're fatigued, when we're hungry, and when we're exhausted. Those are the times when we are most suggestible. Now, here's the other thing. The more that you think I can't be hypnotized, you're some of my favorite people, because you will be. And you're not aware that on a regular basis, you're probably also hypnotizing yourself. That's just the reality of it. So to wrap up subconscious, here's how I'm going to dovetail this. There are a number of ways that we can influence our own subconscious by getting in touch with those thoughts, dreams, feelings, and imaginations. Now, one of the ways that I'm familiar with a hypnotist who talks very candidly about changing a belief system. He calls it powering through with the belief system, because sometimes to reorganize a belief system means that you have to work really hard at convincing yourself with your higher mind or the thinking brain to shift a belief. Here's how this works. There was a period of time shortly after I got into police work where I told you I had an imposter syndrome. The first 5 or 6 years that I was on the job. That's not uncommon, but I didn't know that that was a thing at the time that I was going through it. I just thought, any minute now they're going to come and they're going to fire me because they're going to figure out I really don't know what the hell I'm doing. The fact of the matter is, I sat down with, as I told you, Michael Gelb's book and a Tony Robbins book, How to Think Like Leonardo da Vinci, 7 Steps to Genius Every Day, and Tony Robbins' book, Awaken the Giant Within. So by having a different conversation with myself and examining my belief system, and I've been saying this for the last 15 years, why do you believe what you believe, and is it still true? So probably 70 to 80% of what we believe we learned in childhood. And I get accused of being a conspiracy theorist when I say, how do you know that that's true? We don't have firsthand evidence often right in front of us. Well, that questioning in my mind comes from the fact that when I'm looking at things that are being put in front of me, I'm thinking, who took the picture? How did this happen? And there are things that just don't make sense in my mind. And I guess it's because what I started to look at was I've been led to believe a whole lot of things throughout the course of my life and just assume that they must be true because the people around me believe them. This happened to me when I got into undergrad in 1987. I took a religious studies class because I wanted to know what is the right religion. I wanted to know, how do I know that it's the right religion? I didn't have any firsthand materials in front of me, don't speak a lick of Hebrew, Aramaic, ancient Hebrew, ancient Greek, and I didn't speak Latin. Can you see the problem? I was ignorant. I own that ignorance. But in that, I began to look at each of these religions, and I started to examine them from the standpoint of what would one have to believe to think that this is true. Now, if you look around, and again, I'm pointing this out not to try to convert people, although I would love it if, everybody came to know Christ. That would be my personal bent. Here's the thing. Out of all of the world religions, only one has prophecy and delivers on prophecy, and has delivered on prophecy. Only one is systematically rooted out. Now, you might be thinking about the Jews. I'm not talking about the Jews. I'm talking about Christianity. Why is it so bad? And why is it that atheists don't pick on Buddhists? They don't pick on Taoists. They don't pick on I forget the name, the Japanese religion. They don't pick on these. They pick on Christianity and say, well, there can't be a God. Okay, great. But what is so threatening about a God? It's incongruous. But can you see, though, how if we develop a belief system, and I've talked to people that are, dyed-in-the-wool atheists, and I applaud them because they have a far higher degree of faith in what their religion is than I do in mine. Because, for them, it is a religion. And a lot of things become a religion, but we don't attack some of those things the way that we do Christianity. Now, again, this isn't so much about the Christianity as much as it's about why do you believe what you believe. I had an experience when I was 14 years old, October 30th, 1984, 7:49 p.m. I came in from bow hunting, and I heard my mother say to my grandmother downstairs, "Mother, it's time to get up and go to bed." And then the next words out of her mouth, she was hollering for my dad to come down and help her. My grandmother had passed away. My grandmother lived with a Bible in her lap. This is a woman who preachers would call and say, "Bertha, I'm getting ready to preach on this. What are your thoughts?" I've got my grandmother's library, and I refer to it quite often in my own studies, but also when I'm leading Sunday school or when I'm leading some type of ministry. So here's why that's important. She died with a smile on her face. As a police officer, after that point, for over 25 years, I saw a lot of death, both unattended and attended death. I saw a lot of people whose faces were twisted up in horror. Now, some of those people died horrific deaths. I'm not going to argue that. But the other thing that I recognized was that I only saw one other person die with a smile on his face. That would happen to have been a minister. And what that told me was this is somebody who was like my grandmother. So my belief system was formed in 1984 that this is how this works. So you can see, though, how something so profound has an impact. And then the anecdotal evidence throughout the course of my career demonstrated to me that that was an accurate belief and that I should continue to believe that. Now, I still question a whole lot of things in my faith. I really do. But the difference is that when I'm questioning, it isn't am I questioning is there a God? It isn't am I questioning is there a Jesus? What I'm questioning is what are the facts around the Father and the Son? That's what I'm questioning. And why do I believe that the King James Version is better than the Geneva Bible, is better than any other Bible? Why am I believing that Baptist is better than Free Methodist or Free Methodist is better than Catholic? Because in all of those experiences, what I'm looking for is something that rings true for me based on what I believe. Well, how did I learn to believe that? Can you see how this thread is coming disentangled now? Because the belief system was predicated by my parents bringing me up in a Free Methodist church. I was in church on Sunday morning, Sunday evening, Wednesday evening, and then a few times throughout the week because of things going on at the building. But I was constantly surrounded by Christianity. Now, my grandmother went to something called Pilgrim Holiness Church. It's Lutheran. So why am I not Lutheran? I don't agree with the Lutherans because my belief system says while it's a worthwhile set of practices, it's not what I choose to believe, and the methodology behind it isn't what I choose to adhere to. It's as simple as that. I'm not saying that one is right and the other is wrong. I'm not convinced that being Free Methodist is the right answer either. What I'm convinced is that it doesn't say Free Methodist or Lutheran anywhere in the Bible. Now, tangentially, there is a translation that uses Lutheran. But Lutheran comes from Martin Luther, who was a Middle Ages guy. So anybody that came along, 300 years after Christ, I'm a little suspicious because of the Jesus plus factor. Jesus didn't say, by the way, love me as you love yourself, and the gate is narrow. To me, the road is wide. And by the way, you should be whatever, XYZ. It's not in there. Doesn't even say be Jewish. Because he also talks about people outside of the Jewish faith having access to heaven. So can you see, though, I hope I've painted a good enough word picture here to demonstrate the point. That belief system has been systematically reinforced with a whole lot of other resources. But again, I don't speak those ancient languages. So I'm relying on guys like Michael Heiser, John MacArthur, Vadi Bakum, and a host of others to present me with materials that they've had a look at. Because the thing is, for me to go to Israel and to try to look at some of those texts, they're not going to let me anywhere within 3 feet of those and touching them. And again, I don't read those languages. So I'm having to rely on somebody else to present information to me. Now that brings me to Kristen Beck. Kristen Beck talked about the fact that after, or anything before 1850 is good, anything after 1850 is not. And I'm kind of keen to that because, again, in my anecdotal experience, the thing that I believe is that history is not what we've been told. And here's the reason why. I've got 2 books from prior to 1850 that tell a very different story about how the Americas were settled and who was here. So that begs the question, which one is correct? The ancient text, well, ancient in terms of, near history of more than 100 years ago, or what we've been told in classrooms. Because what I'm finding, and I figured this out when I was in graduate school, and it took me a little while because I kept thinking, why doesn't this add up? I intuitively understood some things about how humans behave based on my experience as a police officer. I was keen to see that, there are about 4 different kinds of people that I was encountering on a regular basis. But encountering them and paying attention to the way that they behaved, I became a lot better at predicting what kind of a person I was going to be dealing with. So in that, it also gave me an opportunity to be more safe in the way that I conducted myself, both on traffic stops, family trouble calls, domestics, you name it, because I understood those kinds of people and their thinking, and I understood their belief system. There it is, the belief system. Because what do they believe? Well, in many cases, there's an entitlement attitude. In some cases, there is I'm not good enough, and the only way for someone to notice me is if I do something really bad. The third type is that person who is trying to stay just below the radar, but is also just trying to function. And they're struggling to function because every decision tends to get them into some kind of trouble at some point. And sometime I'll share with you the 4th. But not to belabor the point, just to point out that everything that we believe, we're basing on our firsthand observation and our experience. Now, here's the interesting thing. How do we know that what we experienced in the past was true? Didn't see that coming, did you? Well, false memories can be implanted. And I just for giggles today, I was listening to a past life regression video, and they were talking to this person about this past life. How come they're not speaking the language in the dialect that they would have spoken it if they were actually inhabiting the body of the person that they claimed that they were at the time that they claimed that they lived before? Because they wouldn't know English. Would they? I don't know. This isn't an area of my expertise, but it was just something that occurred to me as I'm listening to this man talk about, 9 past lives in different regions of ancient Europe. And they claimed in the video that there was evidence that this person actually existed. So here again, depending on where you live, what do you have access to? Could the mind have been salted and seeded? Maybe. I don't know. Could he have seen a documentary? Could that ancient history be his passion? They did indicate that the guy was an avid lucid dreamer, and this is a guy who spent an awful lot of time exploring past life regression. So I say all that to say the first 2 parts of subconscious really and truly are about the fact that we have a belief system that is fundamentally rooted in what we learned in early childhood, and it continues unless we approach it, like I did in 1995 when I read both those books. because the way that I fundamentally changed was I went from being a naive kid from a farm town in the upper Midwest to having a little bit more on the ball to recognize that not everybody behaves the way that the people in my hometown did. But it also opened my mind to recognize that I wasn't limited in my potential. Because like most people, I think, well, this is my lot in life. This is what I meant to do. And I was setting artificial limitations for myself, thinking, well, this is what a person with a bachelor's degree from a university that most people don't know exists. I went to Ferris. I'm sorry if anybody's offended that I said a university most people don't know exists. Because I really loved my experience at Ferris. But the thing is, when I got to California, people are like, you went where? They had no idea it existed. That's just a thing. But, here in Michigan, we know exactly where things are, and we're pretty comfortable with, what's here, because somebody in our family or somebody we know makes use of those things. But again, that goes back to our belief system, which is rooted in our subconscious. But that's also the place where we're creative. This is the place where we're also storing some of those archaic memories that are to protect us, and some of which are to invite us to joy. So the thing that I mentioned at the beginning about the battle space is the mind. That's why it is so important that you examine, what do I believe? Because I was thinking about this recently, and let me know what you think in the comments. If a person at a distance at Google or some other entity, WEF, whomever, decided that they wanted to start implanting memories. And it made me think of two movies, because dystopian movies have a tendency to kind of predicate these things. Whether that's coincidence or not, I don't know. I leave that to others. But ultimately what happens is, in those movies, somebody is implanting a false memory. It's kind of like Memento, except not exactly. But it's more like... It's more like a futuristic movie where, and in fact, there was, I think, there was a Doctor Who episode, and I'll have to go back through my my in-house library to find it. But the memories were not original, and they were not his own. I want to say it was the time of the Doctor when he became John Smith. But the idea is that, how do we know what is real? How do we know what is not real? And we keep hearing from scientists that the world is a hologram. So what does that really mean? What does that mean in terms of the experiences that we have? How real are those experiences? And how do we interpret them, and what do they mean to us? How are we cataloging and storing those? And, the craziest thing is, recently more has happened that I have had to go back and access memories of my time as a police officer. Which I found strange. And then accessing memories from childhood. I went through my old neighborhood from when I was 0 to 11. And it's interesting to me because when I look at it, I can recall things, but I don't know if they're true. I really have no idea. Because everybody has a different perspective on what happened. And it's the same issue that we see at crime scenes. 12 people will see 12 different things through the lens of their experience and their interpretation and what it means to them in the moment. I once interviewed a guy. He said the gun had to have been, like a 50 gauge. The barrel was at least 2 inches around, and, the gun was the biggest handgun I've ever seen. It was a Colt 38 snub-nosed detective special, and if you've ever seen one, not the largest gun you've ever seen. But for him, it was a cannon. Because the guy didn't have any experience with firearms, and when it's pointed at his face and a guy's telling him, give me all your cash, there you are. So let me wrap this up. This is going to be a whole lot shorter than part 2. This was supposed to be at the end of part 2, but I've had so much trouble with Ma Bell and the internet. So here's what you need to know. The subconscious is a complex and fascinating place. And I talked in the last video about the reticular activation system and its role in storing memory. Often in the therapy room, I talk with people about how to use the reticular activation system and the autonomic nervous system. These are located midbrain. They don't have a language. But what is there is high emotion attached to picture, sight, sound, smells, and intuition. Because anytime that we're involved in something that triggers a highly charged emotional response, whether that's positive or negative, it stores a snippet of that in order to recall predicates so that it knows how to protect itself. And this is why I tell people, hear what you heard, see what you saw, feel what you felt, know what you knew at the time that this occurred. Look for the triggers. When I'm asking them what happened just prior to either the anxiety episode or the feeling of depression. Often, when I ask them in that way, they can access it because they're not coming directly at the memory. What they're coming at is sensations. So just know that's one way that we can begin to approach the unconscious, because the RAS and the ANS are attached to the subconscious. Well, that's going to do it for subconscious. I had intended to talk a little bit more about the battlefield for the mind, but I'm going to just refer you to the CIA's website and the intelligence agencies. Jane's, I think, also has some information on the battlescape of the mind. It's a fascinating subject. Maybe at some point, if I get brave enough, I'll do a video episode on the bioethics and the issues of the battle space of the mind. Well, that's all for now. This is Kelly, the Kilted Therapist. Thanks. Bye.